So, welcome to the show. My name is Mohammed Kalaji. I'm an AWS community builder and software developer at Zero and One. Today, I'm with Eddie. Eddie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Eddie Hinkle. I'm an engineering manager at Glassdoor. I focus on design systems and front-end foundations. So that's like the frameworks and libraries that all front-end engineers at Glassdoor use. I've been in tech as a software developer for over a decade. And yeah, I just love chatting about technology and how we use it as humans, what it means to us, and meeting new people. So thank you for having me on.
So you currently work as an engineering manager at Glassdoor. Would you like to talk more about Glassdoor? What does it offer and what does it services it offers in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So most people know Glassdoor as the review site. But really Glassdoor's mission is to help you find a job and company that loves you back. And so they do this through anonymous conversations, right? We started with anonymous reviews where people can go on the website and say, hey, I work at this company and this is what it's like to work there. They can give, ratings to the CEO and different things like that. And the next step of that was ratings for interviews, right? What is the interview process like? Because sometimes it's nice to work at a company, but it's horrendous to get through the interviews. And so there's interview ratings, and all of that's anonymous. And then more recently, last year, we purchased a anonymous professional social network called Fishbowl. And so we have begun integrating that into the Glassdoor experience so that people not only can give reviews, but they can also ask questions and say, hey, tag Google, tag Facebook or Meta and say, hey, what is it like to work there, right? I have this very specific question that applies to me, maybe questions about a specific department. And then people who work there can reply anonymously, but identified as working for that company. So yeah, it's all about just building using anonymous conversations as a foundation for really finding a job that works, the way that you need to work.
So, for example, let me just recap on this. So I go to Glassdoor, I log into my account, I would search for a job that, let's say, for example, I want to work at Amazon as an example.
Yeah.
I would apply on the website to apply for Amazon, or I just see the reviews of the company and I see how people's interview process get into it. Some people might share some information about the interview process altogether, or it's like I apply on the website so I can get a job at Amazon. Because let's say I'll take example of Amazon because they have a jobs portal, and from the jobs portal you do apply for the job, or just you see the reviews of the company or the people who work there.
Yeah, so it's a kind of a combination. So we partner with Indeed. So when you go to Glassdoor, you can see jobs that are available, right? That are listed on Indeed, which obviously is the biggest job site, ever. And so you can get Indeed results, but then we mix those with the information that people have given us. So you find out, yeah, hey, there's a front-end engineering job at Amazon. And then you're like, well, but what's it like to work at Amazon? So then you can click in and say, well, what kind of reviews have people left for Amazon? And you can click in and look to see how they rated specific dimensions, how have they rated the benefits? Maybe the benefits are what matters to you. Or maybe it's work-life balance. You can see how people have rated work-life balance. So it's both finding the jobs that exist, that have openings, and then looking into those companies and figuring out if those companies give you what you need.
Yeah. So you work at Glassdoor as an engineering manager of design and front-end foundations. What are the requirements for an engineering manager, and what is the qualifications for someone to become an engineering manager in general? So it's not necessarily, let's say, an engineering manager as just front-end, but in a general term, in a general sense, if you want to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So, what it takes to be an engineering manager is really a combination of two things, right? You need to be technical. You need to understand the technical trade-offs and technical decision making that happens. So you need experience as an engineer. I've actually talked to people who have started down the engineering manager track, maybe, just after a couple of years, and they've been successful as a people manager, but now being at like the director level and the senior director level, like I've had people tell me in confidence, like, I actually wish I had been an engineer longer, because sometimes I feel a little bit less stable in the technical discussions. So definitely you need a good solid foundation of time as a software engineer. But you also don't want to just see an engineering manager as the next step for a software engineer, right? A lot of companies have an individual contributor path where you can become a lead and a principal engineer and all those things, so you can stay focused on the code. If you're thinking about becoming an engineering manager, one of the things that you really need to be passionate about is about helping people succeed, right? Helping mentor people, helping coach people. It's very people focused. Instead of just having like, hey, I need to finish project A, B, and C. The things you do kind of don't end, right? They evolve and they change, but you don't have as good of checkbox feeling of, oh, I just finished this code, I made this commit, I finished this project. And then there's a lot of coordination, right? Working with your team, working between teams, you become the glue for your team and other teams. And particularly, you become the umbrella for everyone above your team, right? So different companies have dynamics with different, people up the food chain. And your job is to protect your team from any bad decisions from, senior management and things like that at that company, right? To help kind of keep them focused on their job and their world that they can work on, rather than getting distracted by kind of, sometimes the whims of senior management. I haven't thankfully run into that at Glassdoor, but working at previous companies, right? Sometimes you have to be that buffer for your team.
So I'm just going to get like an idea about this. So if, let's say, for example, I've been software development for like 10 years as an example, I've decided to become, let's say, like a Scrum Master, and I got the certifications. Does this qualify me to be like an engineering manager? Let's say, for example, I've already passed, let's say, the tech lead or a principal. So I've already dived my hand at the code, but I've learned the people management part, let's say like Scrum. I got the certification. I've worked with, let's say, for example, a year on Scrum or managing people. Does this qualify me as an engineering manager at some level?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you'd probably be an intro level engineering manager, right? Like there's obviously like intro, senior level, right? There are different like levels of responsibility. So you probably wouldn't jump in at the highest level of responsibility, but yeah, you'd get a couple direct reports, right? And then you're responsible for helping them level up their career, right? Writing reviews for them, either annually or semi-annually, having one-on-ones and giving them feedback. Like how can they improve? What, challenges are they running into? And really finding what is a very heavy in like conversation, one-on-one conversation, giving feedback. Like if you're not, if you don't like confrontation, like it can be a difficult position because you will oftentimes find yourselves in confrontation, right? And you have to know how to handle that well. Like you don't want to like come and yell at someone, but you still have to tell them something that's a little bit confrontational that they may not agree with. And so that's definitely a big aspect.
So also as well, and working at Glassdoor, you also work as the Frontend Foundations. So you mainly focus on system design and Frontend Foundations. You mean like you organize stuff on the front end from a design and code perspective? Or let's take, for example, if let's say React.js, since it's not opinionated. So let's say some developer might choose this library, some person might choose this state manager or something like that. So your point of your job is to coordinate all of those developers to fixate on one thing because this is the optimal thing for this project. Correct me if I'm wrong here.
Yeah, that is pretty accurate. So yeah, we, product engineers view their stakeholders or customers as the end users, and we view our stakeholders and end users as the other front-end developers in the company. So we kind of do two things. Design system is about making sure we maintain information for like the visual design of Glassdoor. And part of that is a component library for iOS, a component library for Android, a component library for the web. And so, when someone needs a button or someone needs a dropdown, they don't have to create that from scratch. We kind of maintain that as kind of like an internal open source repo, so they can do pull requests and say, hey, we need this new feature in a dropdown, but we are the maintainers of that project. So we look and go, that starts to make it a little bit too nitpicky, like that should probably be in your own code. Or we say, hey, that's a great feature, let's pull that into our component library. So maintaining the similarities across all of our microservices is the goal of the design system. And that's something we run. And we have several designers on our team and a product manager on our team, as well as front-end engineers. And then, from the front-end foundation side, that's exactly what it is. We use React.js. And for a long time, we've had an internal Node.js server that does server-side rendering and serves that to the client. And we realized that's not really maintainable. So recently, we researched a bunch of options, and my team realized what we need to do is use Next.js because it's open source, it's already available, it works with React for us. And so, so we kind of did a pilot of that project. We connected with the different areas of the company, different front-end engineers, and said, hey, how does this work for you? And ask questions about their projects and what they need, and made sure that Next.js is something that will actually work for everyone across the company. And now we are building libraries to allow them to use Next.js, but still do all the things that they need to do within the Glassdoor ecosystem. So it's really about, making sure we get reusable tools and we equip them to be able to be as efficient as possible so that they can focus on the product that they're building and not the tools that they're using as much.
So as an example, let's say you created the front-end foundations, so everyone should have the exact same, let's say, design schema of Glassdoor. But what does it differ if, let's say, you use something that's already existing? Let's say, for example, Tailwind. It already has all the classes for you finished up. It's all responsive. All you need to do is just put the Glassdoor's color schema, and you might have a similar thing without writing that much code.
Yeah, it's a great question. That's definitely a factor. But we basically try to make sure we have all the tools. So as a front-end foundations team, we evaluate Tailwind, we evaluate, do we want to use an off-the-box component library, Bootstrap, right? We evaluate all those things and figure out what do we want to build in-house, what do we want to reuse, and we basically kind of have an open door where if a developer finds a better way to do something, we want them to try it out and bring it up to us and see if it's something that can work across the company. We don't really want people just grabbing something new, putting it in without talking to us, because then all the different teams start to use different stuff. And then if people move between teams and things like that, there's not a consistency to the code. So we are kind of the maintainers of code consistency in a way. But we work with the people in the company to figure out what is it they need. So recently, we were using kind of a homegrown form library, as well as another area was using an open source React form library. And a group of people were like, hey, this isn't really working for us. We need a newer, more modern React form library. So they are doing a pilot right now. They picked out 3 ones that look good, and they are trying to redo a single page in all 3 of those. And then they're going to come back to the team and say, hey, here's where those were good and here's where those were bad. And then we'll decide as a team and a company, which one are we going to stick with? And then we'll have that as this is now the form library that we use inside of Glassdoor. And so then all the front-end engineers can know, and we kind of maintain the documentation to say, hey, if you need a form library, this is the one for you.
But isn't handling a pilot for testing out things, isn't it a little bit costly on the company at some level? Some companies can't afford to do, let's say, a pilot at some degree.
Yeah, it definitely depends on how big the company is, right? And how many people you can employ, right? If you're a small startup moving at breakneck speed, you're going to want your process to be very minimal because it's more important to get your product to market. As you get into bigger and larger companies like Glassdoor and right, eventually Amazon and Google, the consistency and stability of the system starts to become more important than getting to market, because you can get it to market, but then when you want to add new features or change things, or when you hire new employees, right, the ability at which the new employee can get up to speed is sometimes more important than how fast like one person can get a product out the door, because you're working at a larger scale. So I think that's definitely a big factor in having an internal team, like Glassdoor does, focused on Frontend Foundations. Is you need to have enough engineers and be hiring enough engineers to be able to make that team worth it and make things like doing pilots worth it, to make sure that you're making the right decision and that no one's going to have to, like, if you're doing a pilot for the same type of thing every like year, then you're doing it wrong. Like, your pilot should be verifying that this thing's going to work for the next several years for the company.
So I'm going to move to another question, which is, you worked as an engineering director of user experience at Threat Connect. Your work there included helping the team reduce context shifting, keep top priorities clear, and encourage team collaboration, along with hiring new teammates. Would you like to talk more about this, along with the hurdles of managing a big team? So it's similar to how you're managing your team at Glassdoor, but I think the amount of people at Glassdoor is a bit much more than Threat Connect, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So, so I think like the people reporting to me at Glassdoor is actually less than the people that reported to me at Threat Connect. But obviously the number of employees at Glassdoor is much larger than the number of employees that were at Threat Connect, as that was a smaller startup. So yeah, I have a relatively small team that reports to me directly. I mean, I would say our whole team, like designers, product manager, and everyone included, is probably like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like 6 or 7, like on our team, because we're kind of just, like I said, kind of the open source repository maintainers, and like we help, but like we don't do all the work ourselves. At Threat Connect, all of the front end development and designers reported to me. So it was a team of 8 or 9. We had we had one designer. We were working on hiring another before I left. And then we had several UX engineers that were really kind of focused on bridging the gap between front end development and design. And then we had a handful of front end engineers themselves, working more on the logic and the application side of things rather than like the components and the visual side of things, which the UX engineers were working on. So yeah, there was a lot going on there, right? Everyone that did any kind of front end development reported to me. And so I was not doing any hands-on code. I wasn't even overseeing like one project. I was overseeing work on all the applications and all the projects. So it was really about, being a coach and helping, coordinate and make sure that like the team that was working. So Threat Connect's a cybersecurity software as a service. So we had like case management, which is, kind of like, oh, there's an incident and, an analyst needs to investigate that. And we had threat intel, which is like, oh, we need to make sure we're analyzing the latest stuff that's been happening, right? Like there's a new hack on this company and there's a news article that comes out about it. They need to read that news article, collect that information, and put it into our software as a service to understand what threats are out there and be proactive and defensive. So in one way, your team is like responding to emergencies, and the other side, which is like offensive, and then you've got like the defensive, trying to make sure that no one can get into your thing. And so we had 2 different teams working on each of those systems. And then we had like a core system team that was making sure that like the platform itself was good, right? And that like automation was working and things like that. So just making sure all those different pieces were all headed in the same direction without them having to like have meetings every day or something like that. So I was kind of helping create that coordination and help manage coordination with like my peers, right? There was a manager in charge of all of our database and backend, and there's a person in charge of all the product managers. And so making sure we are all heading in the same direction, and that like the features that were coming down 6 months down the line, a year down the line, were fleshed out and that they were the right direction.
Yeah. So speaking of being a coach, you also participated as a mentor for ADB List and the Colab Lab. What are the requirements for someone to be considered as a mentor, and what is your expectations when dealing with someone as a mentor? So let's say, for example, expectations where someone might be high technical level but needs some refinements, or would you consider most people, let's say, like lower technical people that you want to try to help them? I've tried mentoring people that give you like a personal experience. I've tried mentoring people who come from one different background to another. So I've been mentoring someone who was working ASP.NET for like 5 to 6 years and teaching her to move towards writing front end with React.js. It took a lot of time, by the way, but she finally got a job, which is really good.
That's
she
awesome.
Shifted to a different company, a different role and everything. She's totally happy. It took the process around 2 years of mentorship. It's a lot, but I've been like following up on everything she was doing. But the thing is that her technical level in ASP.NET was a lot different than React. So there's a lot of shifting, even though she comes from a high technical level. So there's some background of, let's say, data structures and writing algorithms. So when you, let's say, for example, for being a mentor, would you be more of a mentor for someone who's more like high technical level that you need to give them some refinements? Or would you were mentoring people who are like low level, where you're trying to introduce them to something, trying to teach them into it? Or it was a mix between both?
Yeah, so I would say the majority of the people who I have mentored tend to be a lower technical level and looking to get into tech. That isn't necessarily just like the preference I had. I really just kind of made myself available, and like those were the people who were looking for mentors, and so I was happy to help. Like as far as my expectations, I am a high enough technical level. Like I have been happy to help people like anywhere in their stage, right? So if they're trying to break into tech, if they're trying to shift tech, or if they're trying to figure out if they want to become an engineering manager or an individual contributor, maybe they're a senior and they're trying to say, okay, the next path from senior is either engineering manager or heading up into like a staff engineer. And they're like, what do I want to do? So I am familiar with all of that stuff. But yeah, the majority of the people I've helped have really been trying to break into tech. Oftentimes they have another career. Like one person I talked to was in higher education, right? And they're trying to break into tech. It hasn't been as much technical discussion as far as like career and job hunting discussion is really how I've helped them the most. Typically, they're also in like a boot camp or some other program that is helping them learn how to do things technically. And then I'm helping come alongside them and like helping them think through how to try to get the job, right? Once they're done with the technical, or if their technical approach is if the boot camp they're going to is going to be a good one, right? Like, well, what are they teaching you? And, is that actually going to be worth your time? So that's mostly ADP List. Collab Lab is, because ADP List, I'm just kind of a mentor on there. Someone can find me and ask to have a session. The Collab Lab is an intentional thing where they build cohorts of 4 engineers, and then they have several mentors. And really that is helping people. They've already learned the technical skills. It's more feedback about how do you work a job, right? How do you do a pull request? How do you meet and work on a project with other people? How do you write, we already have the tickets written, but like, how do you look at a ticket, decide what needs to be built, right? Based on requirements and kind of that actual like on the job collaboration stuff. So that's what the Collab Lab is more about. And yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move to a question you might like it a lot more, which you have the core values that you have on your website. I'm going to list them. First one is value every person. Second is choose whimsy. 3 is stand up for good. 4 is live in draft mode. 5 is embrace empathy. 6 is enjoy the ride. 7 is work hard, rest harder. And 8 is prioritize longevity. Would you like to talk about those core values, why you decided to list those core values up to the public? Like, what's the purpose of having, let's say, core values?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's kind of two things there, right? Like, why do I have them? And then secondly, why do I tell other people about them? So I think, why I have them, it serves as a sounding board for me, right? When I'm trying to make a decision, when I'm trying to do something, and if I'm conflicted between a couple of different areas, by having these values, I can look back and say, for example, changing a job, right? I have a couple different opportunities, right? One job is going to work me to the bone, but man, it's going to pay some sweet money. You know what I mean? And the other job is going to pay a little bit less, but they've got good work-life balance and they're, having a positive impact on society. Rather than maybe a negative impact on society, then looking back through these core values allows me to kind of disassociate myself from the actual decisions to be made and the temptation of, say, the money, and look at the drawbacks and look and say, okay, does working at this job help me value every person, stand up for the good in the world, right? Does it help me prioritize longevity or work hard and rest harder, right? If I'm working, to myself to the bone, like that's not prioritizing longevity, right? And in the same way, like I can look and be like, okay, this company might not pay the most, but I'm going to be doing good in the world, right? They value people. And yeah, like I think I'm at a point in like product development, which is what I've done the majority of the time. I'm doing more internal tooling now, but oftentimes building tools, like you can just end up building stuff that is, functional, but not enjoyable. And so like I've choose whimsy, partly for that. And secondly, because I can really get focused on work and I forget to have fun myself. So choose whimsy is in some ways just a reminder for me to just have fun in life and try to relax. And I think, everyone, myself included, you get nervous to write that blog post, to put out a tweet, to put yourself out there, and live in draft mode just says, you know what, like, I just need to let myself be, like, put everything I have out there, not be too worried about how I come off, like what people think about me. I just need to say, hey, like, I don't have everything figured out, but I'm going to do what I can, right? And also assume that other people are also like living in draft mode, right? Like to not just say, oh, this is a horrible person because they did A, B, and C. Maybe like they're in draft mode and they just need to fix and tweak a bit of, their decisions they're making. So yeah, that's why they really exist. Why I put them in public, partially it is to inspire other people, right? Like I hope that some people might, be really bogged down and they are like, oh, hey, choose whimsy. What's that about? And they kind of get inspired. They're like, you know what? I should have a little bit more fun in my life. I also know like in the tech industry, I work in the tech industry where there is not the most diversity, right, of people and things like that. And I am essentially the epitome of like the tech industry. Like I am a white, cis, male, American. Like if you go down like the like list of what people expect the standard programmer to be, I probably match it. And so, my goal, like part of it is like a lot of people who match all the same things I do, they don't want to expand diversity in tech, right? They have different opinions that don't align with mine. And so part of putting the values out there is telling people, hey, here's what I believe, like I believe like everyone's valuable. Like I believe everyone brings good to the job. Like I believe that, tech is better when we have people of all races and people of all, genders, like all coming together to solve problems, So really it's also just letting people know what I'm about and what I'm not about.
So it's more like, let's say, let's say for an example, I'm going to give my example of myself. I journal every single day. So let's say for example, I take the decision of, I want to write, let's say I want to join this company. So I write down what my thoughts on this. Maybe it's not paying me that much, but I might enjoy the job and all of that. I've been journaling for more than 3 years, and I have like wait a second. I take it to the next level. I have like fountain pen collections.
Wow, so, that's impressive.
Yeah, so I take it like to the next league kind of thing. But sometimes I would just sit down just to hype me up to write about it. So I take this idea. So let's say your core values that you've already posted about. I would just like take the decision from the core values. I would write down and say like, okay, maybe this company offers not the highest paycheck, but it might make me do something that's good for the people around me or a set of people out there. So I might consider the job. So the core values is more like you found out throughout your life that these are the things that did work with you. And you decided to like, hey, I'm not going to just keep it to myself. I'm just going to share it out. Maybe someone else might benefit from it. It's kind of like this kind of approach, if you want to say.
Yeah, that's well said. That's exactly what it is. And yeah, like you said, I kind of use these, like to evaluate things, decisions. And it's like at different stages in our life, different things are important. It's like, okay, if I look and I don't have much saved for retirement and I have a whole bunch of debt, maybe taking the job that works me to the bone but pays me really good, like that might align with prioritizing longevity, right? So it doesn't mean that like the company that works you long hours is necessarily the bad guy. In my stage of life, like that's not what I want to do. But depending on your circumstances, like prioritizing longevity may say, yeah, take that job that you're going to be working a lot of hours, but it's going to pay you really well to get you from where you are today to where you want to be in the future. So yeah, like you said, it's just the things that I've found that kind of help me feel more of me.
But are those like, let's say, a biased kind of approach? So you've already set the rules, so maybe I might have a different kind of set of rules that might have worked for me?
Yeah. Everyone may have different rules, right? And even my rules might change over time, right? Like some of them won't, right? Like I've always believed I should value every person, right? Now, how I interpret that has evolved over time, right? As I've learned new things. But something like live in draft mode, I haven't always felt like, oh, I should just put myself out there and do whatever. Like I've been more nervous and shy and like held back. And one day I realized, you know what? It's not that scary. Like I tried putting myself out there sometimes and I realized it's always worth it when I put myself out there. So now I wrote live in draft mode because I want to remind myself I haven't always done this, but when I put myself out there, I pretty much always am glad I did. And so I want something to remind me to continue to do that.
So I'm going to move to a different question. I think this question, since I wrote the set of questions a long time ago, so I think this one changed, which is on your website, you have the sentence stated, I manage people, processes, and software development through a human-centered interaction paradigm. Everything in life, whether our daily work or the software we use, feel natively human and engage us both emotionally and cognitively. Alongside with the testimonials listed on the website, that you're more of a genuine leader who value people's emotion much more solely than getting the job done. Do you want to explain why you tend to go towards that approach? And if someone crosses the line with their action, let's say, what would you do? Since there will be time where there's a strict decision to do towards work. So you're more of a, I'm going to say this, you're more of a genuine leader who values people's emotions. So you might be the kind of person who doesn't want to break someone's heart. When they do something, you might tell them like, hey, buddy, maybe we can do this, or maybe we can do that. There's no hard feelings. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to give you the benefits. But there's sometimes be like, someone screwed up big time, and you're gonna tell them, hey, you screwed up really big time. It's like we can't be the nice person right here. You did something bad, which happens.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, but why would I want to go towards everything as a human and engaging something emotionally and cognitively, especially in software? So I'll give, let's say, an example. If I want to create something, let's say a CRM for technical people, it doesn't have to be something that's emotionally or cognitively inducing. It has to do just the job, while other things might require you to do something more humane, right?
Yeah.
Let's say if you're building an application for someone, it might wants to feel much more human-like. Let's say like you want to create a booking app, let's say like Airbnb. You can't make it very non-human, cognitively, emotionally, something that's going to attract the person to use the app at a certain level. If you want to elaborate more on this.
Yeah, definitely. So, you would think that things don't always need to be engaging emotionally and cognitively. But when I say that, I don't necessarily mean you have a fuzzy animal that's greeting you on the intro. For my view of that, it's much more, there's this framework called Octalysis that, let me see what his name is, because I've forgotten. Yukai Chow wrote about Octalysis, which is a gamification framework. Gamification and kind of has a bad rap, but it's this idea that everyone in life needs epic meaning, accomplishment, empowerment, ownership, social influence, scarcity, unpredictability, and avoidance. So all of those things trigger emotional responses inside of us. And you don't necessarily want to use all of those things in a single application. But if you have two CRMs and one uses behavioral design is a phrase that Yukai Chow mentions with Octalysis, right? If you design behaviorally so that the application connects with them on a deeper level, they will be less likely to cancel the subscription than one that is just completely functional. So absolutely, your first job is to say, okay, what are the tasks that this person needs to do? But then you say, how do I make that task the easiest thing and the thing that resonates with them the most, right? That causes them to want to do that thing. Right. So I think that's definitely a key aspect as far as software is concerned. You want to think about how this person feels, right? If you have a really slow CRM that every page takes a long time to load, that's going to make them emotionally frustrated, right? So it's keeping the human emotion and mental model in mind while you're building, but not necessarily being explicitly emotional, right? MailChimp, always had these funny little sayings. That's great, right? That's more whimsy than emotionality to me. Emotionality is just observing and understanding what that user feels when they're engaging with your software and designing for that. On the flip side, right, about people management, you nailed it. I want to support people. Unfortunately, there are times you can't support people. In fact, when I first became a manager, within 6 months, I had to fire someone. And that sucks. Sometimes people go years with being a manager without having to fire someone. And it was, you always remember that person's face when they look at you and they know that they don't have a job anymore. That's not something that you just brush off. But ultimately, the human-centered paradigm says I'm not just looking at one person, I'm looking at all the people, right? So as a manager, I have people, a whole team that reports to me. And so ultimately what it happened was I got to the point where like I looked at someone, right, who wasn't doing the job, and I looked at the other humans on my team who were sometimes working overtime and they were putting everything they had into it. And I realized, like, looking at it from the human-centered lens, like, this is so unfair to all the other people on my team who are giving everything that they have and sometimes giving more than they should be because they're kind of picking up slack for someone else on the team. And they're all the same level. They're all getting paid the same, you know? And so in that place, while it hurt me to have to let that person go, like, and it took a little, I gave them a lot of grace. Like, I just kind of, you know, kept giving hints, and I got more and more blunt the further in we went, until finally, you know, it was like, well, there's not much else I can do here. And so ultimately, my care for the other people that reported to me became the driver that said, now this person has to go because they're a detriment to the other people, you know, underneath my kind of view or underneath my guidance, right? And so, yeah, it's all about protection and encouragement. But how do I protect and encourage those people, right? And sometimes, yeah, like, it may hurt to have a hard conversation with someone, but it's kind of like parenting for those who may be listening who are parents, right? Like, sometimes you have hard conversations with your kids, and it's like, you don't want to do that, but you know it's in your kid's best interest to hear this. And so I think that's really what it comes down to, like, remembering that the people I'm working with, the people I'm managing, the people I'm mentoring, my collaborators, like, all those people are human and they have all this other stuff going on in their lives. And so I need to try to have as much empathy as possible. But at the same time, I also need to help them be everything that they can be. And so sometimes we'll have those rough conversations because they need it, right? When they get 2 years down the road and they do something better because I pushed them into an uncomfortable place, like, they're going to look back and be like, man, I'm so glad that Eddie did that. You know, it was hard at the time. I was frustrated. I even thought, why the heck is Eddie making me do this? But they're happy that, you know, I did it in the long run. So that's really how I approach that and balance the hard times with keeping humans in mind.
Like you're saying, some people might need like a hard push to realize something that they've done wrong. So you might not realize that you're doing something that's bad until someone either points it out to you, but in a very tough way.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, in the same way, it's kind of like the benefit of the doubt, right? Like, most humans want to do the best job they can, right? So when I'm having a conversation with someone who isn't maybe doing the best that they could, am I going in and assuming that they're lazy and that they don't care? Or am I assuming that for some reason they're not seeing something or they're not understanding something rather than just not trying? And so by doing that, I can come in with a very human-centered approach of like, hey, did you realize you were supposed to be doing this? And they're like, oh, yeah, I know I'm supposed to be doing that. Okay. What does that mean to you, right? Because I think something might have gotten lost in translation. And most of the time it's like, oh yeah, something got lost in translation. Like, they didn't realize they were doing something a certain way, or they didn't realize there was an expectation of them that wasn't being met. And most of the time that covers. And occasionally you have the people who, you know, kind of don't care. And then that leads to the previous conversation I just had, which is like, well, then
what if there's an
edge
case? What if there's an edge case, for an example? Let's say this is an edge case. Let's say I'm an employee. I have, let's say, I'm going to give an example. I'm 24, so it's not the current state, but let's say I'm a single dad and I'm trying to raise a child and I barely have time between handling work and the child, as an example. So I might have, let's say, thoughts in my mind, let's say what I want to do to the child, but at the same time, this is occupying my mind on the work. So there are circumstances with people where they are pushed into a position that it's taking their mind out of work sometimes. So they might not be delivering as much as efficiently as someone else. Would you resolve towards giving them the same judgment as someone who's lazy? Or would you be like giving them more chances because they are in a situation? But eventually at the end, you'd be like, okay, I gave this guy or this person a huge amount of opportunities to fix things up or to at least amp things up a little bit. I'm not seeing that much progress. So for the interest of the company, I might hire someone who can do the job. But there are use cases where you cannot just give the same treatment for someone who's just like lazy or laid back. He doesn't want to do the job. What's your take on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, right, I think one of the reasons my values, right, are used when choosing a job is so that I can choose companies that allow me to live with those values, right? So for example, Glassdoor has unlimited PTO. And it's a company that actually believes in unlimited PTO as opposed to like, okay, we're going to say it's unlimited, but really no one's going to take any leave. And so that's huge because now as a manager at Glassdoor, that means if I do run into someone with that situation, I can say, listen, like, do you need to take every other Friday off? Like, so that you can deal with life stuff so that you can be more present during the days that you are working? Or like, do you just have a lot you need to get done and like you need to take a week off now and deal with all the stuff that's happening at home so that you can come back focused? There's a lot of flexibility because we have that unlimited time that like as a manager, that equips me to deal with each person in their own unique circumstances, right? It's not like, oh, you're limited to 3 weeks. Sorry, like that's what it is. It's like that's huge. And some companies I would be in a place where I had to like make that call, like, listen, you have no more time off. Like you need to show up and do your job. Like, so definitely picking the company, right, where I'm a manager at that allows me to live my values is definitely a key part. And so 100%, I agree with you. Like, it's like, okay, what's going on in your life? How can I help support you? Right? Let's get you like no one who's trying to work through all this chaos in their head is going to do a good job. It's always better to have someone work less hours, less time, but be clear-headed than to give full time, being distracted. And so it's like, okay, if I can get you some time and I can get you some focus and you're able to come back focused, like that's better for you and it's better for the company, right? It's better for everyone involved. And yeah, eventually, right, if things go on and on for a long time, then you start to have conversations and figure out, okay, like, what do like, does this person actually need a part-time job rather than a full-time job, right? Like, start talking about their priorities in life, their circumstances in life, and like what they need to be fulfilled and what they need to honor their life circumstances. And like, that's how I can come in and support them, while at the same time also saying like, listen, this position, this is probably what we need, right? Like, you're not going to work part-time hours for a year. Like, that's not going to cut it. And so just talking about what the company needs and what they need and figure out if it aligns, and if it doesn't, like, how can I support you to find the thing that you need, right? Maybe they need to do part-time contracting. Maybe we have the flexibility to hire a part-time contractor. I don't know, like, right? But having those conversations, until you have those conversations, you don't know what someone needs. So,
but if someone doesn't want to talk about those certain things, like they kind of like want to keep it to themselves, they'll brush it off, tell you like, oh, okay, nothing's going on, and they just don't want to have this hard conversation. Like, sometimes talking about hard things is hard at the same time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
How do you deal with those
Yeah, I think a key point there is at Glassdoor we have this program I'm in called the Journal Lead program and stuff. And one thing we've been talking about in it is the difference between disclosure and vulnerability. Disclosure gives you details, but vulnerability gives you truth. So I don't always have to have disclosure, right? I don't have to know what's going on in your family, right? I don't have to know what's going on in your finances. But vulnerability is what I'm looking for. Vulnerability says, oh, man, there's a lot going on in my family right now. Like, it's really hard to focus on work. Boom. That's it. Like, you don't have to tell me what it is going on in your family. As long as you say, I got a lot of personal family stuff going on. And I'm like, great. What do you need to be able to focus on that, right? Let's get you some time so you can focus on that and come back, focused. So that's really what I'm looking for, is not disclosure of the details, but vulnerability about what they're experiencing in their life. And when we use that vulnerability, we can break through. If someone is completely shut down to being vulnerable at all, then, and they just keep saying, oh no, everything's fine, and they like, and I kind of pry, and like eventually I'm going to have to take them at their word that everything's fine, which unfortunately isn't great for them, because if they say everything's fine but they're not getting the results that they should be if everything's fine, that's a mismatch. And I mean, then I have to honor their word, and at that point we're probably going to have some hard conversations. But that's going to be after I've really tried to pry and like dig in and say, listen, like I don't need to know what the details are, but it really seems like there's something going on that's keeping you from doing your best work. Like, you know, can we talk about that a little bit? Like, I don't need to know the details, but you know, like, do you need some time off? Right? Like at some point I might even just say, listen, like it does seem like a lot's going on. Like, do you just need to take a week off and like clear your head and work on some stuff and then come back focused? And if like, no, I'm fine. Like at some point I can't help someone if they don't want to be helped. And that's kind of like the end of the road, right? Unfortunately, but there's a lot of levels before that.
I'm going to give like a last edge case. I know I've been talking about this, but let's say, for example, if someone wasn't talking about this certain issue, let's say, I'm fine. And when you tell him the tough truth, like, hey, buddy, you're off the team because you're not that, and they crack down and they start telling you, disclose every single thing that they have a problem in. So they finally cracked, if you want to say. Would you change your perspective on the letting out, or that's it, you take the decision? So let's say, back to the single dad example. If let's say I've been telling you like, hey, I'm feeling good. You realize I'm not giving my optimal job. And then you're telling me like, hey, you're off the team because we expect this certain amount of tasks to be done. You didn't do them. And then I cracked. I told you like, hey, I've been having this problem with my daughter. She's in the hospital, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've been telling you every single thing, but at the last minute. Would you rethink about the whole letting off, or would you just like, we've taken the decision, that's it, it's final, you should have talked to before?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So typically before I let someone go, like I give some very strongly like worded language, right? Like, you know, things really aren't working with you here, right? Before I'm actually letting them go. So if they don't crack when I'm giving them, you know, some pretty strong signals in the one-to-one, like, listen, if things don't start changing, like that's probably going to impact what, you know, your job here is like. That's their point to crack. If they don't crack for that point, like at some point I've filled out the HR paperwork, and typically, at least in this remote world, like when people are let go, HR is involved. Like, right? Like it's not like I just walk up to someone's office and I'm like, okay, you're fired. Like you fill out paperwork. To fill out paperwork, you need proof, right? You need a paper trail of what they haven't been matching. So like once HR is involved, there's really pretty much nothing you can do. Yeah. So like if someone cracks once, it's actually like we're saying the words "you're fired," then yeah, like there's pretty much nothing you can do at that point. But my job as a manager is to make sure that I'm as explicit as I can be about their state before we actually get to that point, so that if they're going to crack, they'll crack in the one-to-one 1 week before I file the paperwork with HR. You know what I mean? Like when I know that like I'm keeping notes about what is not going right and that I'm working on that for HR because it's not working, I'm going to have some, you know, strong words in the one-to-one to just tell them that, listen, you're in a bad place. Like we need to change this or bad things are going to happen. And yeah, like at that point they've got to break down and confess, or it's out of my hands.
So I'm going to shift to a different question. I've taken a little bit of time on that, but it's good about talking about different case scenarios because I don't actually get to see them that much, but you get to see them on a daily, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
You don't fire people a lot these days, do you?
No,
Nope.
Thankfully not.
No, I'm going to shift to a different question, which is as someone who works at Glassdoor, which is a hiring job review website, what are the qualifications that everyone should strive towards when aiming towards getting hired in the industry? So it's more of a general question that what should I focus towards? What should I aim towards getting hired in the industry? So let's say, for example, someone might say, hey, you should fix your GitHub profile, or you should have, let's say, like a Stack Overflow account with a certain amount of, let's say, streaks or a certain amount of questions answered. Some companies do care about those kind of things, which is very weird.
Yeah.
But what is your take on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think some of the most important things is showing that like you can do the day-to-day work, right? So how do you show that? You show that by working on projects, right? Whether it's open source, whether it's something like the Collab Lab where you work in teams. One of the most important things that companies care about when they're looking at, say, like a junior engineer, right, who's trying to break into the industry, one of the biggest challenges is like, okay, you can follow a tutorial and like you can put code together. But can you look at a task and figure out what needs to happen to make that work, right? Can you collaborate and communicate well with the colleagues on your team, with the product manager, with the designer? Those relationships and those decisions and like troubleshooting, right? Those are the things that it's really hard to decipher in, say, like a junior engineer. Once someone's had like a sequence of jobs, right, where they've done that stuff, then it's much more about like, okay, what kind of experiences are they looking at, right? Like if they're looking for React and someone has more React, then great. Like, or if they're looking for someone with geospatial knowledge and someone has more geospatial programming knowledge, like great. But when you're like junior and getting in the door, the biggest thing you can do is do projects with other people, even if you don't get paid, right? And freelancing is good. It's a good start to show that someone will pay you for your work. So I think kind of the combination of having someone pay you to program in some way, right? Freelancing or any other gig, and then working with other people to program, because very few companies hire a single programmer to do a job. Most companies are hiring you to be on a team, and how you work with a team is one of the biggest questions that they're going to be sorting through. So I think for me, that's the biggest stuff for getting a job.
But what if, let's say, for example, I've been in the industry for like a set amount of years, but when shifting between a job and another, I'm doing something different. So I'm in a newbie in some sort of way. So let's say, for example, first year I did React, and then the second year I shifted to a company that I did geospatial kind of things. And then the third year I shifted towards, let's say, backend, and then something else. Let's say on a time period of, let's say, like not 5 years, so give a smaller one. Let's say on a period of 2 years, I've shifted between different companies, like a lot, let's say, and you've learned different kind of things. I'm still a newbie at some sort because I haven't put my hands super dirty into something for a while. So that makes me also a newbie. So when I go to a different company, what's your expectations like? Oh, this guy is like 2 years in the industry, but he shifted a lot. What's the take on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first thing as a job seeker that you have to think about is that it really depends on what they're looking for, right? They have an idea in their mind. Do they have a bunch of senior people and they just need more people like to be able to tackle tasks? Or are they looking at like needing people with some very specific knowledge? For example, when I was at Threat Connect, we had a large team with some really good people, and I knew the next person we hired had to know a lot about Angular and had to know a lot about the Angular CLI and build process, right? Because that was like with everyone on our team, that was the biggest missing hole. So like the thing you have to know is like sometimes the job that you're applying for, like, and you might get rejected, and it's not about you, right? It's about this company has a very specific hole that's missing on a team, and sometimes you just are unable to fill that hole. So I think that's the first thing to like be aware of is like sometimes it's going to be a numbers game. There's going to be a bunch of companies out there and they've got positions open for holes that you just don't quite fill. And you just gotta put a lot of applications out there. Last year in 2021, I did a job change, right? Ended up at Glassdoor. But I sent 114 applications over 90 days with 63 companies. Some of them never responded. Some of them rejected me. Some of them we had interviews, and some of them rejected me after interviews. Some of them I told no, right? No, because I didn't like the way things went. No, some I was interviewing with when Glassdoor made the offer, and I was like, I like the Glassdoor offer better than seeing what happens with this company. So I'm gonna tell them I'm all done. I've accepted the job. It took a lot, right? And this is me going from a director of engineering, which it's a startup. So really I was an engineering manager, right? Startups, you end up getting more loftier titles than our reality. But as an engineering manager with over a decade of experience, I still had to go through all those companies, right? And there was all sorts of things. I was interviewing at everything from like an IC role to, at one company, I was going to be the head of engineering, and so kind of everything in between. And I actually was with one company. It was a small startup, so there wasn't a whole bunch of people that would have been reporting to me, but I would have been the head of engineering. And I was in the final interview, and it was me and one other person, and they ended up choosing the other person. And that's fine. Looking back at it, I feel blessed to be at Glassdoor, and I don't think I would have had the flexibility and the experiences I'm getting at Glassdoor, even being the head of engineering at another startup. But that's just the world you go through. You never know what's out there, and you never know what you're going to find. But that said, if you're in a place where you're juggling this stuff, right, and you have a lot of short experiences or a lot of different technology, I think some of the biggest things, right, if someone's looking at you and saying, okay, you don't know a lot about this technology, the biggest thing you can do is show that you're a learner, right? Lean into all that experience. You got to take the bug and you got to make it a feature, right? The thing that someone may look at your resume or your job and think, oh, well, you don't qualify because of that. That's your selling point, actually, right? You have to think, how does this make me better than someone else, right? I can learn. I've learned 5 different programming languages in the last 3 years, right? May not want to talk about the details of why you had to learn those 5 different programming languages, but you did it, right? The way you can learn, the way you can adapt, right? The way you think, that's what you want to lean into, because if they're hiring someone who hasn't had a lot of experience, they want to know that you're a go-getter. They want to know that you are a self-teaching person, that they're not going to have to teach you all these nitty-gritty things, and it's not going to take 2 years for you to ramp up. But you can tell a story in the interview, right? In your bullet points on your resume, in the culture interviews, you can tell stories about, hey, how I started this new company and ramped up in 30 days and was doing this, this, and this. And what things did you complete in only 30 or 60 days that no one else in the company was doing, right? Because you hopped in there, you ramped up really quick, and you were a rock star. And showing how quickly you can have an impact is going to be huge when you are coming in without a lot of previous experience in that specific type of programming.
Actually, the whole point of being a learner that earns you much more of a job. There's something that I've learned from a hiring manager before, is that it's easier to vet a curious beginner than to tame an experienced person.
100%. Love that.
The reason why, because the someone who's starting out, who's let's say, for example, who's someone who's curious and starting out, you have a much more easier way to vet him to work on the company's code than someone who's experienced, who already consumed different kind of companies' ideologies, and he will start forcing his ideologies on you. Then the curious person, you tell him hey, you should do 1, 2, 3, and the curious person will be like, okay, I'll do them. I'll do them that. While the experienced person might come up and say yeah, this doesn't work with me, I'm not going to do this. And you might want him to do this and be like, nope, I'm not going to do that. So as someone who's actually curious and starting out, it's a selling point, because companies be like, okay, I can vet someone who can work for me and I can make him do what I want, which is what I want in a company. But at a certain level, you might realize that some of the company's ideologies are kind of skewed a little bit at some level. So they might tell you hey, this is how things happen. But in a different company, they might tell you this is an easier way to do it. You don't have to pull yourself into doing all of this to do this. But the whole idea of being a curious person is a selling point by itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
But why would you resolve towards sending that much applications in a 90-day period? Is it like you want to get into a higher position paycheck wise? It's like every single person that I knew who changed jobs has a different point of view of this. So
Yeah.
someone actually, they say that they changed jobs after a period of time because they increased their salary. Some people might say, hey, I got bored at this job. I'm just changing to a different job because I want to feel something new at a certain level. What is your point of view on this? If you like to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I've changed jobs for all sorts of different reasons, right? Sometimes, yeah, I don't feel like I'm getting paid enough. Other times I don't see, like, I'm kind of bored in my current position and I don't see a path of growth, right? So sometimes I'm just looking for more pay for a similar position. Other times I'm looking for a promotion and there's no promotions available at the company I'm at. I think definitely, I left my last job over pay. I felt like I was very underpaid. I actually used Glassdoor, salary info that's on their website, which ends up in retrospect being really funny. But I was bringing that to my manager and saying, listen, like, I'm getting paid, this much less than other people, with similar job titles. And and they were not receptive to those conversations. And so my biggest thing was trying to get, what I felt was comparable pay. And so, yeah, in the past, I sometimes haven't even gone on a job hunt. Like, oftentimes I've had like a couple recruiters reach out to me and I'm like, sure, I'll have that conversation. And, one thing leads to another, and then I end up with a job. This last summer was one of the biggest times I did a big job search. And so, yeah, definitely one of my biggest things was I was like, all right, it's time to make sure I'm getting paid what I'm worth. And one of the ways so there's a couple of things, right? One, I was applying to a lot of big name companies, right? I applied to Glassdoor. I, applied and was interviewing with Square. I don't know. There's too many companies to go through them all, right? And some of them, like, never heard back from Google and Netflix. Surprise, surprise. Like, that's okay. One day I'll hear back from Google and Netflix. But so I threw out a bunch of applications. Some were at startups where I could actually like lead engineering teams. Others were at big companies that, but the other thing is I know over time I've learned that when you have a job offer, the best way to get the most money is to make sure you have competing job offers, right? If someone offers you a job and they say, we're going to give you, $50,000 and you say, I would like $60,000, please. They'll be like, why? Sometimes if they aren't too worried about it, they'll give you the $60,000. But at the other way, like if someone's like, here's $50,000 and you're like, oh, well, I just got an offer for $70,000. They'll be like, oh, how about we give you $65,000 or $75,000? We'll even beat them. You'll get the job that you really want with more money if you have a job you don't want as much that pays money as like an offset offer. So that was definitely also another factor, was I knew a couple things, right? One, the other thing is if you are already in interviews, oftentimes they can move you faster through the interview process. So there's many times like I hop on a call with a recruiter and they're like, hey, like, are you, at the end of the call, they're like, are you interviewing with any other companies? What kind of stage of the interview process are you at? And I'm like, oh, I'm in final interviews or on-sites with like 3 other companies. They're like, oh, okay, we're gonna expedite this as quick as possible, right?
I got you on this one.
Yeah.
But wouldn't it be easier, let's say, instead of, sometimes you might offer, let's say, a salary, but it's a low ball than what they're actually giving. Wouldn't it be easier to be like asking them, hey, what's the budget for the role, instead of lowballing yourself?
Yes. Typically I try to lean towards the budget. Depending on the company, right? Like oftentimes they'll ask you, well, what's your range? And yeah, then like you said, they'll kind of lowball your range a little bit and stuff. So there's a whole bunch of nuances there. Yeah, so it's tricky, but definitely I didn't have a specific company I was like, I want to work at. I was like, I want to work at a bigger company, a more well-known company, and I want to make some good money. And so I was like, I'm just going to spray out applications everywhere and see what happens. I left I left my existing company, Threat Connect, before I had a job. So I kind of had like, one of those kind of month or two breaks. So I also, like, one reason I applied was because I wanted to get a job fairly quickly because I didn't want to be out of a job for like 6 months, but also I had full time. So I basically was interviewing almost full time, like almost like a full-time job, but it allowed me to go through all these different companies. And yeah, I mean, ending up at Glassdoor, I just feel blessed. So it worked.
So I'm gonna shift to a different question. Is that
Sure.
it's a very different question that's not technical, which is you host a podcast called WebJoy. The goal of the podcast is to bring lighthearted, diverse conversations with people across the tech industry about their origin stories and what brings them joy. Similar, I think, to what we're having right now at a certain level. Would you like to talk more about the podcast, why you resolved towards creating a podcast in the first place? And is it the first time you created a podcast before?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, as far as the first time, no, I have created some podcasts before. I think it's the biggest and largest project I've worked on. I did some smaller, I did a smaller interview podcast for a little while about something called the Indie Web, and basically I was interviewing people about their websites and about what they'd done on their websites. Kind of community-based podcast. Did a couple episodes, and that ended up falling off. I also did kind of one of those standard tech chatting podcast for a little while. I had a co-host, and my co-host and I, it was called Two Dads Talking, and so we were both dads. And what the tagline was, faith, family, and tech, or tech, faith, and family, or something like that. But basically, we both loved tech. We love fiddling with tech. We love talking about Apple and stuff. We both, we're dads, and so it's like, well, how does technology work in our families? And yeah, and faith didn't come up a whole lot, but we both had similar faith backgrounds, so we kind of tied that in. But so that we did for off and on, once a month or something like that for a year or something. But then I had my most recent child, and we both got pretty busy, so we let that one fall to the side. But WebJoy is definitely the biggest project I've picked up. I worked on it for several months before it even got released. We've only released 17 episodes, but I have about 50 recorded.
That's a lot.
It's massive. And I've been so blessed, just all the different people that I've been able to get to be on it. As you mentioned, the goal is diverse conversations. I've looked for people who literally are executive leadership in companies. I started off with Jason, and at kind of head of developer experience at Netlify. And I've also interviewed people who literally are just learning technology. At the time of recording this, the next episode to come out is actually going to be with someone named Kat, and she decided to drop out of medical school to learn programming. So she's currently going through a boot camp. She hasn't gotten a job in tech yet, But what made her have that decision, and decide to drop out of medical school and pursue technology was a really interesting conversation. And so, that was a really interesting episode as well. So having these episodes where it's okay, you have people who, just are looking to get into tech, people who have been in tech for a couple of years, as well as people who are, at the executive level, and really also not just developers, but designers and product managers. And I have a conversation with a recruiter on there that's coming up in a little while. And so, yeah, just a whole bunch of different people and conversations, and really just kind of getting a feel for like how wide and deep the tech industry really is. Cause I feel like we can get really myopic, right? That was kind of my goal, was I kind of wanted to like take all the blinders off of people. Oftentimes I just kept seeing on tech Twitter, like fighting about Tailwind or fighting about Remix versus Next.js. And I just got sick of all the negativity, right? It's like, well, people oftentimes can't just be happy that someone else has something they like. Like instead they have to go and spit on it. And it's like, don't just spit on something. Like it's okay that you don't like Tailwind or that you don't like Remix, right? Or you don't like Next. It's okay that you feel like Remix is better than Next, right? Or that you think Remix is just trying to shortcut Next, or, you know, whatever else. Like, but people can like multiple things. So for example, I had one episode with a former coworker that I introduced to Miro, and our whole conversation was about how cool Miro was as a whiteboarding software, and how he like used that to connect his team at the beginning of the pandemic and build out like a team really focused on a singular mission. And then an episode that released somewhat recently at the time of the recording this, they actually had used Miro for a long time, and then they started using FigJam. And so they actually in the podcast say, oh, bye-bye Miro, like I'm using FigJam. And so I just love that I can have a podcast where one person talks about how awesome Miro is, and the other one is like, I'm leaving Miro for FigJam because here's all the cool things I like about FigJam. And we didn't talk bad about Miro. They even mentioned that Miro is like really cool, but they talk about what they really enjoy and appreciate about FigJam, which was really cool. So yeah, that's what it's all about and kind of what inspired it.
I want to just highlight on two things. Number one, I think there's a tweet from the guy who created Solid.js on Twitter. He said, just use what works. Like, just don't fight over things. Just use what works. Like, he gave a compliment about React, which is very weird because he's the guy who created Solid.js, and he's like telling you, hey, just use what works best. Like, you don't have to use this specific thing just because you like it. You just use what works best for the project. I remember this tweet. Like, he's like the ending all wars. It's like, okay, just use what works. But recording more than 50 episodes without releasing them, that's a lot, man. Like,
well, I didn't record all 50 before releasing any of them. I just I recorded like, I don't know, 15 or 20 before I started releasing them. And then I kept recording instead of stopping. And so now I've gotten to about 50 that'll be released between we're recording in September. Sorry for breaking people's mental model since I'm not sure when this is being released, but between September and December, we're releasing the rest of those. So
I actually took a different approach. I was like, I'm just going to contact someone. It's like, I'm going to set up questions and just do like, make it very basics. Like, I'm not going to go record because I have a lot of things to do in my life. So I was like, I'm going to make this a lot more easier. It's like, I'm going to contact this person and tell them like, hey, this week I'm free. If you're free, we can do it. But I would have, let's say, a set of people. I just want to give a shout out to Polywork. I've put like an opportunity to get people on the podcast, and I got like 75 people in a row. Like one day,
that
I was
is
like,
so cool.
And here's the thing. I did this podcast as an experiment. I first started out like talking about topics, and one of my friends told me like, hey, how about you do interviews? I was like, okay. And he hooked me up with two people at Amazon as my first two guests. And I was like, okay, I'm going to continue on this. I kind of like this. So when Polywork first launched up, a friend of mine gave me like an invite code because it was invite only. It's now general public to the people. So it was like invite only, and they introduced opportunities. And I was like, let's see, I'm going to do an experiment right now. I'm going to post this opportunity. I'm looking for guests for the podcast. Let's see what's going to happen. So I posted it, let's say on 2 p.m. I went to the gym at like 6. I finished my gym session and there's like 75 emails and they're like popping up more and more. It's like people telling me like, hey, we're interested. It's like, well, I think I'm set up for the year, but I'm taking it very slow. It's like I go with someone, I tell them like, hey, do you want to do this? They might tell me like, okay, I want to do this. Take my time onto it. I don't want to pressure myself and the other person. So I would just like do it one at a time. But recording 50 men, I wouldn't do that. It's so hard on me.
I don't recommend it. Yeah, I think the path you're doing is similar.
If I had more time, let's say days where I don't have that much work or I have other applications, I would say, yeah, I would do a couple of days on the week. Let's say after work, I would do like 1 interview or 2 interview and then record them, release them by time. I would say, yeah, but I couldn't do something similar. I like to take it very easy on me.
Yeah, well, and you have to set up the podcast to support that, right? So your podcast is great. It's really in depth. You take a lot of time, right? You've done a lot of prep work behind the scenes for people. Like he had all sorts of questions written out ahead of time, which is awesome. He did his research. So you do a lot of that stuff, which is great. And it turns out into a great long episode. The only way I've been able to record so many with WebJoy is I basically tell the person, hey, I'm going to talk about your origin story. I'm going to ask you what you find joy in. And then we're going to, have time for like a shout out of something you've been involved in or something you've produced for people. And it's going to be 30 minutes max. Like I schedule a 30-minute time slot. And at the end of that 30-minute time slot, we stop it and we leave. And so, very short, very compressed. We hop in the call and I'm like, okay, let's hit these 3 points. And we just have a conversation from those points, and whatever it turns into, it turns into. But that's the only way I've been able to record that many, is keeping it tight, keeping it concise, which generates a very specific type of episode, as opposed to yours, which is a different feel. And I think I love this feel, and I don't think, like you said, you could mass produce an episode like this. So I like it.
I remember I did an episode like 3.5 hours with one person. It's like
wow.
3.5 hours. It's like Joe Rogan level kind of things. Like you sit with someone, you're just like talking with him all the time. It was like the first experience I take episodes, but usually most episodes are like 1 hour-ish range. Nice. So they have like this consistency of 1 hour, 2 hours. Mostly I would say like an hour and a half is like my sweet spot, I would say. But 3 hours and a half, and this is the fun part. 3 hours and a half, and we have like a half an hour before we started and half an hour after we started. So if you want to say like 4 hours and a half, so it's like 4 hours and a half talking with someone. Yeah, it was intense. It was really intense. I returned back home. I crashed on my bed and I slept. But it was really a good episode. I got someone who started the engineering team at Facebook in the UK. And he talked about his experience, about how he started the whole thing, along with other stuff he did at Facebook. It was a pretty interesting episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I always end the episode with a mental health question. It's something that I've done it with all episodes. I love doing it for the sake of releasing the last question for talking about a mental health thing. Have you ever faced burnout or imposter syndrome? And if you did, then what do you do to resolve this issue? The reason why I talk about mental health at the end of the episode is because I like to decompress things at the end. And mental health is something we face in the industry. A lot of people report back that they face a lot of imposter syndrome, burnouts, depression, because of the field, over how demanding it is or how stressful it is. You sit in front of a screen most of the time. Some people might develop social anxiety because they're not meeting with people. The list goes on. I'm not going to get into much into details of it, but would you like to share about your experience on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if I've faced burnout as much, but definitely imposter syndrome. I mean, I find I face imposter syndrome at pretty much almost every like job I get, particularly anytime I change roles. So I was like, and I didn't always realize it was imposter syndrome. I went from being a government contractor to like this new design agency that was doing all this modern code in Angular. And I was used to using some older code, and it just felt like I didn't know what was going on with Angular. All these other people were doing really cool things, and they knew like how to use the framework. And it was just, I felt like all these people are so modern and I'm so behind, right? And then like when I became a manager, it's like, okay, I'm a manager, but everyone who was on my team had been at the company longer, so I was still figuring out the code base. I was still figuring out how the company like operated. And like, I didn't know a whole lot when I became an engineering manager about like what our tool did. I had just worked on some features before that. And so I felt intimidated, right, in that role. To add that to that intimidation, I joined the company and I had a manager. That manager ended up becoming an individual contributor on the team, and then I became the manager. We kind of did a swap because he went international, and so he couldn't maintain the manager duties. So I literally was managing the person who had been my manager like for months before that. So that was intimidating, to be in every meeting and have the person who used to make the decisions like in there, and like in the back of your head, you're like, am I making the right decision? Like, do they, like, would they have made a better decision? And yeah, like, I think obviously starting at Glassdoor, I mean, like, so intimidating because I've only been at smaller companies, and suddenly like I got to Glassdoor and I was hired on as a lead engineer, and I looked around and I was looking around at like the people who were senior engineers, and I was like, these people are so good and they're seniors. And then I'm looking around at the leads and I'm like, how did they do what they're doing? Like, how am I going to be a lead here? Like, I was terrified. But at the end of the day, I think I've really pushed against imposter syndrome by reminding myself that imposter syndrome is telling me, like, when I feel those feelings, that fear, right? That's telling me that I'm in a place that I don't have a lot of experience, right? It's telling me that I'm stretching myself, I'm trying something new, and kind of bringing it back to earlier, like I lean into my values, right? That I'm living in draft mode. Like, I don't always know what I'm doing, but I just got to give it my best shot. I got to do the best that I can. And it was amazing. Like, I felt imposter syndrome for the first 3-4 months at Glassdoor. And at some point it started to fade away as I felt more competent there and didn't even like realize it. It just slowly faded away. And at 6 months at the company, like, I was doing a talk for all of engineering about TypeScript. And like, that really like resonated, and the whole company is moving towards TypeScript now. And 6 months after that now, right? So now a year in, I got moved from a lead engineer to engineering manager for a whole new team that, like, the team didn't really exist. They kind of had formed a temporary team by pulling people from across the company, and then they decided to solidify it, and they shifted me into that engineering manager role. And if you had told me that's where I would be a year before that, like, I would have said you were crazy. Like, I was like, I'm intimidated. I'm just figuring out this whole big company, much less that I would be like proposing a shift across the entire company, front-end engineering to move to TypeScript in a public talk, and then becoming an engineering manager, which actually my team is now with Next.js. Like, we are also doing TypeScript. So like, now I am managing the team that is literally going to implement TypeScript across the company. And it's like, I never could have believed that I'd be there a year before. But I just leaned in and said, okay, I'm in a new place. I'm uncomfortable. And I just got to do the work. I got to focus on the work. And eventually, I know the imposter syndrome will fade away, because it always has before. But I promise, when I go to a new company or a new job, and even, I mean, I'm gonna be real vulnerable here, and I'll be honest. I face a little bit of imposter syndrome in this new role at Glassdoor. I'm leading a team, so I was a lead engineer at Glassdoor, which already felt like a little bit of a stretch, right? Then I became an engineering manager. Now the people who report to me, I've got a senior engineer who, they're basically on the cusp of a promotion, right? Like they're at the top of their game. I'm sure at some point soon they'll be promoted to a lead. I've got another lead engineer on that team. And then I've got a principal architect on that team. He has so many years in programming. Like it blows my mind. And I am their manager. Like somehow I have to, right, come in and help coordinate them. And somehow if they run into a hard time, like be their bouncing board or give them feedback. And they're rock stars. Like, how do you be an engineering manager rock stars? I don't know. I got to figure it out. I've only been in this specific team role now for a couple of months. But yeah, I hope in 6 months or a year from now, I can be like, hey, that was scary, but I figured out how to manage a team of rock stars. And I'm sure there'll be something new coming up that I'm starting to feel imposter syndrome by then.
But you might actually have a very good role. Like, even if you have leads and rock stars, you might have someone who's been experienced more like that. But your role is still to chaperone them, spread joy at a certain level. They might feel bumped out to be like, okay, I'm gonna scooch in, I'm gonna spread some joy into you and make you love the thing that you're trying to do. So don't feel kind of intimidated by the role that you have, even if it's quite intimidating, but it's gonna get better by time.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's not gonna end up on something worse. Like, it's not gonna. Most people, the problem with imposter syndrome, I'm just gonna say it very bluntly from my perspective, is that they fear imposter syndrome for two things. Either they feel that you are not up to the job, or you might feel that someone else might take your job.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes imposter syndrome is not just like, I'm not able to do the job. Sometimes some people would say, okay, I got the job, but I'm afraid this person is better than me, that I'm afraid that the company will say, okay, I think we're going to switch roles a little bit. So this guy fits your position much more. We're going to do a switch. Some people fear this. So it depends on the context of where you're dealing with. The imposter syndrome will hit different. So it's not just always about lack of skills, but rather you might have the skills, but you might afraid someone takes your role.
No, that makes complete sense.
So that's the difference between the imposter syndrome, because each person has a different perspective of it. So you might be in a company, let's say now at Glassdoor, you're basically like a fish in a big pond. So you see a lot of people. So you might afraid someone from a different department might take your job. But the possibility for it to happen, it's a little bit less. But you're just filling scenarios in your head just because you're afraid at some level.
Absolutely.
But it's totally fine. It's totally fine. It's part of what the human brain does sometimes.
Yep. Yeah, the human brain, right? Like we're adapted, right, for the fight or flight and determining threats. And sometimes there's not a threat to our livelihood, but our brain is hardwired to look for the threats everywhere.
So yeah,